Fort Sam Houston, Texas, August 1943. The hospital train arrived at dawn, brakes screaming against steel, steam rising from the tracks like breath in winter, though the air was already thick with heat. Inside the converted medical cars, 40 German prisoners waited in silence, men missing legs, arms, eyes, men broken by North Africa's sand and Italy's mountains. They had been told nothing about where they were going, only that it was a medical facility. Karl Brenner, 23, missing his left leg below the knee, gripped his crutch and expected the worst. What he found instead was a hospital ward cleaner than anything in Germany, staffed by American doctors who treated enemy wounded like their own. The doors opened slowly. Medics appeared first. American soldiers in clean white jackets, their faces professionally neutral. They positioned ramps at each car entrance, metal surfaces reflecting morning sun. Karl watched from his seat near the window. Beside him, Hans Weber sat holding the bandages that covered where his right eye used to be. Across the aisle, Friedrich Koch balanced awkwardly, both legs gone above the knee, his wheelchair secured to prevent rolling during transport. "Out," one of the medics called in German. His accent was terrible, but his meaning clear. "Slowly, we have all the time you need." The prisoners exchanged glances. They had expected to be rushed, pushed, treated like cargo, damaged cargo at that, men whose usefulness had ended when their bodies broke. Karl stood carefully, adjusting the crutch under his arm. The stump of his left leg throbbed in the heat, phantom pains dancing where his calf and foot used to be. A mine outside Kasserine Pass, February 1943. One step in the wrong direction, then fire and darkness, and waking up in a field hospital missing pieces of himself. He hobbled to the door. An American medic stood at the bottom of the ramp, hands ready but not touching, letting Karl manage the descent himself. "Careful there," the medic said. "Ramp's hot from the sun." Karl made it down. The medic pointed toward a line of ambulances. Actual ambulances, not trucks or wagons, but proper medical vehicles with red crosses painted on white backgrounds. "Those for us?" Karl asked in broken English. "Yes, sir." "Sir." The American had called him sir. A prisoner, an enemy, a man with one leg who could no longer fight, no longer serve any military purpose. Karl limped toward the nearest ambulance, confusion mixing with exhaustion. Behind him, other prisoners descended, some on crutches, some in wheelchairs pushed by American medics. Some carried on stretchers. The medics worked efficiently, but without the rushed brutality Karl had seen in German military hospitals where wounded men were processed like broken equipment. The ambulance ride was short. Through the window, Karl saw buildings. Proper buildings, not tents or temporary structures. Trees lined the streets. Grass grew green despite the Texas heat. Everything looked permanent, established, like this place had existed long before the war and would exist long after. The vehicle stopped at a sprawling complex of white buildings with wide porches and large windows. A sign near the entrance read, "Station Hospital, Fort Sam Houston." Medical personnel moved purposefully across the grounds, some in Army uniforms, others in nurse whites. Karl was helped from the ambulance by two orderlies who supported his weight without comment, without the visible disgust he'd seen in German eyes when whole men had to help broken ones. They guided him through double doors into a lobby that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. Clean smells, hospital smells, but without the underlying odor of infection and death that had permeated every German medical facility he'd been in. A nurse approached. She was American, dark-haired, maybe 30. She held a clipboard and wore an expression of professional efficiency. "Karl Brenner?" she asked, consulting her papers. "Yes. Ward 3. We'll get you settled, examine your leg, Make sure the prosthetic fitting is progressing properly." She paused, noticing his confusion. "You are scheduled for prosthetic evaluation, correct?" Carl stared. Prosthetic. He knew the word, artificial limb, but he'd assumed that was for American soldiers, for men who mattered, not for prisoners, not for enemies. Yes, he managed. The nurse made a note on her clipboard. "Good. Dr. Morrison will see you this afternoon. For now, let's get you to your bed." Ward 3 was a long room with 20 beds, 10 on each side, windows running the length of both walls. Fans turned slowly overhead, moving air that was hot but at least circulating. The beds were proper hospital beds with clean white sheets, pillows, side tables. Half were occupied by other German prisoners, men in various states of injury and recovery. Carl's bed was near a window. The nurse helped him settle, showed him how to adjust the bed height, pointed out the call button if he needed assistance. "Lunch is at noon," she said. "Dinner at 6. If you need anything before then, just ring." She left. Carl lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling. Around him, other prisoners were equally quiet, processing the strangeness of their situation. "They gave me painkillers," someone said in German. Carl turned to see Hans Weber in the next bed, his eye bandage fresh and clean. Real painkillers, not aspirin or nothing. Actual morphine derivatives. "Me too," another voice added. "For my legs. The doctor said they'd fit me for prosthetics. Both legs. He said I'd walk again." Friedrich Koch, the double amputee from the train, wheeled his chair closer to Carl's bed. "I've been here 3 days already," he said quietly. "Came on an earlier transport, and I need to tell you, everything we were told about American treatment of wounded prisoners is wrong." "What do you mean?" Carl asked. "I mean, they're treating us like patients, real patients. Not prisoners who happen to be injured. They're doing surgery to improve our conditions. They're fitting prosthetics. They're doing physical therapy." Friedrich paused. "Yesterday, an American doctor spent 2 hours adjusting my wheelchair so it wouldn't cause pressure sores. 2 hours on an enemy prisoner who can't walk." Carl absorbed this information slowly. It contradicted everything he'd been taught. Wounded prisoners were burdens, resources wasted on men who couldn't contribute. The efficient thing, the strong thing, was to provide minimum necessary care and move on, save resources for men who could still fight. But America was doing something different. Something that made no tactical sense but somehow felt more human. At noon, orderlies brought lunch. Not soup ladled from buckets, but actual meal trays. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, milk, coffee. The portions were generous. The food was hot. Carl ate slowly, his appetite returning after months of minimal rations. The beef was tender, properly cooked. The potatoes were creamy, rich with butter. It was food for healing, not just survival. "They feed everyone the same," Friedrich explained, eating from his own tray balanced on his wheelchair. "American wounded, German wounded, doesn't matter. Same food, same medical care." That afternoon, Dr. Thomas Morrison examined Carl's leg. The doctor was maybe 50, gray at the temples, with hands that moved gently over the scarred tissue of Carl's stump. "Pain level?" he asked. "Sometimes bad," Carl answered in careful English. "Phantom pain, feel foot that isn't there." Morrison nodded. "Normal. It'll decrease over time, though probably never completely disappear." He continued his examination, checking the healing, testing flexibility. The field hospital did decent work under difficult conditions. The bone is properly shaped for prosthetic fitting. We'll start you on exercises to build strength in your thigh muscles, then move to prosthetic training. How long? Carl asked. Fitting and basic training? Maybe 6 weeks? Full mobility and confidence? 3 to 6 months. Morrison made notes on Carl's chart. The goal is to get you walking again. Not limping with a crutch, but actually walking. It'll take work, but it's achievable. Carl felt something crack inside his chest. Not breaking, opening. This American doctor was talking about Carl's future, about walking again, about returning to something resembling normalcy. He was treating Carl's disability not as the end of usefulness, but as a condition to be addressed. Why? Carl asked quietly. Morrison looked up from his notes. Why what? Why help me? I am enemy. I cannot fight any more. Why not just... He struggled for words. Why spend time, resources, on prisoner who has no value? Morrison's expression shifted. Not to pity exactly, something closer to sadness, mixed with determination. Because you're a human being, he said simply. And you're injured. Those 2 facts are all I need to know. The rest, nationality, military service, whether you can fight, that's not medical. That's politics. I'm a doctor. I treat patients. He returned to his examination, but Carl barely noticed. The words echoed in his head. You're a human being, and you're injured. Those 2 facts are all I need to know. It was the most radical statement Carl had heard in 5 years of war. Over the following weeks, Ward 3 became Carl's world. He woke to breakfast trays, spent mornings in physical therapy, ate lunch, underwent afternoon examinations or treatments, ate dinner, read books from the hospital library, slept in clean sheets. The physical therapy was intense. A therapist named Lieutenant Sarah Brooks worked with Carl daily, building strength in his remaining leg, teaching him balance techniques, preparing his body for the prosthetic that was being custom-made. Push harder, she'd say, not unkindly, as Carl struggled through exercises that left him sweating and trembling. Your muscles have to relearn how to work. It's going to hurt, but pain means progress. Carl pushed. He had nothing else to do, nowhere else to be. And slowly, his body responded. The exercises that left him exhausted in week 1 became manageable by week 3. His balance improved. The phantom pains decreased slightly. Around him, other prisoners went through similar transformations. Hans Weber learned to navigate with one eye, working with an occupational therapist who taught him depth perception tricks. Friedrich received new prosthetic legs, crude by modern standards but far better than nothing, and began the painful process of learning to walk again. The ward's other occupants changed regularly as men healed and were transferred to regular POW camps or as new wounded arrived. But the treatment remained consistent. Medical care without apparent regard for the fact that these were enemy soldiers. One evening in September, Carl sat on the porch with Friedrich and a new arrival named Otto Schneider, who had lost his right arm at the shoulder. They watched the sunset over Texas hills, painting the sky orange and purple. My brother was wounded at Stalingrad, Otto said quietly. Lost both feet to frostbite. They sent him to a field hospital, did the amputations, then transferred him to a facility in Poland. He wrote me one letter before I was captured, said they were given basic care, bandages, some food, a place to sleep. But no prosthetics, no rehabilitation, nothing to help them function again, just storage for broken men until the regime decided what to do with them. He paused, staring at the sunset. I keep thinking about him, about how different this is, and I feel guilty. Guilty? Carl asked. That I'm here, being fitted for a prosthetic arm, learning how to write again, eating 3 meals a day, while he's there warehoused like defective equipment. Carl understood the guilt. He felt it too. The regime they'd served had treated wounded soldiers as burdens. America treated them as patients deserving care. The contrast was devastating. The difference, Friedrich said slowly, is that America can afford to be humane. They have the resources, the organization, the medical infrastructure. They can treat us well because it doesn't cost them anything significant. For Germany, with cities being bombed, supply lines destroyed, resources scarce, every bandage used on a wounded soldier is a bandage not available for someone useful. Maybe, Carl replied, or maybe it's not about resources. Maybe it's about what you value. The regime valued strength, conquest, domination. America values, he struggled for the word, humanity, even toward enemies. They sat in silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Inside the ward, lights came on. Nurses made evening rounds. Orderlies prepared for night shift. The hospital continued its work, treating wounded men regardless of uniform. In October, Carl received his prosthetic. It was a wooden leg with leather straps and metal hinges, primitive compared to modern prosthetics but revolutionary for 1943. A technician named Corporal James Fletcher fitted it carefully, adjusting straps, checking alignment, making sure the socket fit properly over Carl's stump. "It'll hurt at first," Fletcher warned. "The skin needs to toughen up. You'll get blisters, probably some bleeding. But push through the initial pain. Your body will adapt." Carl stood for the first time in 8 months with 2 legs. The prosthetic felt wrong. Too heavy, too stiff. Nothing like his real leg. But it was there. Solid, supporting weight. He took a step, then another. The gait was awkward, lurching, but he was walking, moving forward under his own power without crutches. Lieutenant Brooks stood nearby, ready to catch him if he fell. "Good," she said. "Again, get used to the weight distribution." Carl walked the length of the ward and back. By the time he reached his bed, he was exhausted, and his stump ached where the socket pressed, but he had walked. That evening, he wrote a letter to his mother in Munich. He'd written monthly since capture, though he had no way of knowing if the letters reached her. "Dear Mutter," he wrote in careful German script, "today I walked again. The Americans fitted me with an artificial leg. It's uncomfortable and strange, but it works. I can walk. I wish I could explain to you what this means, not just the physical ability to move, but what it represents. The Americans didn't have to do this. I'm a prisoner, an enemy, a man who fought against their soldiers. But they're treating me like I matter, like my ability to walk again is important, like I'm worth the resources and time and expertise required to help me. I was taught that strength meant hardness, that caring for the weak, the wounded, the broken was a waste. But America is showing me something different. They're strong enough to be generous, wealthy enough to be humane, confident enough to treat even enemies with basic dignity. I don't know what this means for after the war. I don't know what kind of Germany we'll return to, or if you'll even be alive to read this letter. But I know I've learned something here that they never taught us at home. The true strength includes mercy. That power secure in itself can afford to be gentle." He sealed the letter and gave it to the ward nurse for mailing. Then he lay back on his bed, his new leg propped against the side table, and closed his eyes. The transformation was happening, not just in his body, which was slowly rebuilding strength and capability, but in his understanding of what strength meant, what nations could be, how enemies might treat each other. By November, Carl could walk the length of the hospital corridor without stopping. The gait was still awkward. He'd never move naturally again, but he was mobile, independent, no longer confined to bed or chair or crutch. Friedrich had achieved similar progress with his prosthetic legs. Hans had adapted to monocular vision well enough to read and navigate confidently. Otto had learned to write with his left hand. cramped letters that improved daily. They were healing. Against odds, against expectations, against everything they'd been taught about how wounded prisoners should be treated. One afternoon, Dr. Morrison gathered Carl and several other recovering prisoners in a small classroom. He stood at the front, beside a table covered with prosthetic components. Different styles, different mechanisms, different approaches to replacing lost limbs. "I wanted to show you this," Morrison said, "because I think you should understand what goes into the work we do here." He picked up a prosthetic arm, explained the mechanics, the craftsmanship involved, then a leg, demonstrating how weight distribution worked, how the socket was custom-fitted to each patient's unique anatomy. "We've been developing these techniques for years," he explained. "Not just for this war, but going back to the Great War, even earlier. Americans who lost limbs in accidents, in previous wars. We've built an entire infrastructure around rehabilitation and prosthetics because we believe people deserve to live full lives even after injury." He paused, looking at the German prisoners. "I'm telling you this because after the war, when you return to Germany, you'll have knowledge. You'll understand what's possible. And maybe, just maybe, you can help build similar systems there, help your own wounded. Take what you've learned here and use it to make things better at home." Carl absorbed this slowly. Morrison was teaching them, sharing knowledge, not just treating their immediate injuries, but giving them tools to help others. It was another kind of generosity Carl hadn't expected. America wasn't just healing German prisoners. They were training them to heal other Germans. That evening, Carl sat with Friedrich on the porch again. Both wore their prosthetics now, though they still needed canes for longer distances. They watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I've been thinking," Friedrich said, "about what we do after repatriation, after we go home." "Survive?" Carl suggested. "More than that, I want to open a clinic for wounded veterans. Use what I've learned here, the physical therapy techniques, the prosthetic fitting knowledge, the whole approach to rehabilitation. Germany will have thousands of wounded men after this war. Someone needs to help them. The regime won't like it," Carl said. "This approach, treating wounded soldiers as valuable, worth investing in, it contradicts everything they believe. The regime is losing," Friedrich replied quietly. "Maybe when it falls we can build something different, something that learns from this." He gestured at the hospital around them. "America isn't perfect, but they got this right. The way they treat wounded, enemy or not, that's worth copying." Carl nodded. He'd had similar thoughts. Not about clinics specifically, but about bringing home these lessons in humanity. About showing Germans that strength didn't require cruelty, that power could be merciful. December brought Carl's discharge from the hospital. Not discharge from captivity, that wouldn't come until after the war, but discharge from medical care. He was healed as much as healing was possible. Ready to transfer to a regular POW camp. The night before his departure, Dr. Morrison stopped by his bed during evening rounds. "How's the leg treating you?" he asked. "Good, still hurts sometimes, but manageable." Morrison nodded. "Keep doing the exercises, build strength. The more you use it, the better it'll function." He paused, then added, "You've been a good patient, Carl. Worked hard, didn't complain. I hope the rest of your captivity goes well." Carl wanted to say thank you, but the words felt inadequate. How do you thank someone for giving you back mobility? For treating you with dignity when they had every reason not to? For showing you that the world could be different than you'd been taught? "Doctor," he said finally, "you saved more than my leg here, you understand?" Morrison's expression softened. "I think I do. The things you taught me, about treatment, about humanity, I will remember. When the war ends, when I go home, I will remember how you treated me, how America treated all of us. That's all any of us can hope for," Morrison said quietly. That kindness remembered might make the world a little better. He moved on to the next bed, continuing rounds. Carl lay back and stared at the ceiling one last time, memorizing this room, this experience, these months of unexpected humanity. The next morning, Carl boarded a bus bound for Camp Swift, a general POW facility in Central Texas. He carried his few possessions in a small bag, some books, letters from home that had finally reached him, his discharge papers from the hospital, and he wore his prosthetic leg, walking with only a slight limp. Friedrich and Hans traveled with him, along with a dozen other men discharged from various wards. As the bus pulled away from Fort Sam Houston, Carl looked back at the white buildings, the wide porches, the place where he'd learned that enemies could be decent. Camp Swift was different from the hospital. More structured, more obviously a prison. Wire fences, guard towers, roll calls. But the treatment remained consistent with what Carl had experienced. Adequate food, clean barracks, work details that paid small wages, recreational activities. And every morning, when Carl woke and strapped on his prosthetic leg, when he stood and walked without crutches, he remembered Dr. Morrison's words, "You're a human being, and you're injured. Those two facts are all I need to know." The war continued. Months turned into years. Carl remained at Camp Swift through 1944 and into 1945, working farm details, improving his mobility with the prosthetic, learning better English from guards who were surprisingly patient teachers. He wrote regular letters to his mother, though responses came irregularly if at all. In March 1945, he received a letter forwarded through the Red Cross. His mother was alive, living with his sister in the countryside. Munich was ruins, but they had survived. "Come home when you can," she wrote. "There's so much to rebuild. We'll need everyone, even those who were wounded." The war in Europe ended in May. Carl remained at Camp Swift for months afterward, waiting for repatriation arrangements. During that time, he helped organize physical therapy sessions for newly arrived wounded prisoners, sharing techniques he'd learned at Fort Sam Houston. "The Americans have an entire system," he explained to men who had just arrived, men missing limbs or eyes or pieces of themselves. "They believe in rehabilitation, in making us functional again. Learn from them. Take this knowledge home." He was teaching now, passing on what had been given to him, turning the generosity he'd received into something that might help others. In October 1945, Carl was finally repatriated. The journey back was long. Train to the coast, ship across the Atlantic, processing through displaced persons camps. When he finally reached Bavaria, when he saw the devastation that had been Germany, the weight of what he'd learned hit him fully. This destroyed nation needed to rebuild not just buildings and roads, but ideas about how societies functioned, about how the wounded and weak and broken should be treated, about what strength actually meant. His mother met him at the Red Cross station in Munich. She was thinner than he remembered, aged by years of war and privation, but alive. When she saw him walking, limping slightly but walking, tears carved lines through the dust on her face. "You can walk," she said, embracing him. "The Americans fitted me with an artificial leg, taught me to use it. They have programs, systems, entire hospitals dedicated to rehabilitation. Why would they do that? For a prisoner?" Carl pulled back, looking at his mother. "Because they could, because they had the resources and knowledge and will, because they believe people are worth helping, even enemies." That night, lying in his mother's cramped apartment, Carl thought about Fort Sam Houston, about Dr. Morrison and Lieutenant Brooks and Corporal Fletcher, about the months of care, the prosthetic fitting, The physical therapy, the simple dignity of being treated like a patient instead of a burden. And he thought about Germany, about the thousands of wounded men returning home to ruins, to scarcity, to a nation that had no infrastructure for helping them. Men who would struggle without the care Carl had received, without the knowledge Carl had gained. The next week, he sought out Friedrich, who had also returned to Munich. They met in what was left of a beer garden, sitting at a broken table under trees that somehow still grew. "I want to open that clinic I talked about," Friedrich said, "for wounded veterans, teaching rehabilitation techniques, building prosthetics if we can get materials, taking what we learned in America and bringing it here." "How?" Carl asked. "We have nothing. No resources, no infrastructure, barely any medical supplies. We start small. We teach what we know. We show people that rehabilitation is possible, that wounded men aren't just broken soldiers but human beings who deserve help returning to life." Friedrich paused. "The Americans showed us it could be done. Now we show Germans." Over the following months, they did exactly that. Working with a few doctors who had survived the war, scrounging materials from destroyed hospitals, building crude prosthetics from wood and leather. The clinic was primitive compared to Fort Sam Houston, more like a workshop than a medical facility. But it worked. Slowly, wounded veterans came. Men missing legs, arms, eyes. Men who had been told they were burdens, that resources couldn't be wasted on them. Carl and Friedrich taught them exercises, fitted them with basic prosthetics, showed them that function was possible even after injury. "Where did you learn this?" the veterans asked. "In America," Carl told them. "In a prisoner of war hospital. They treated us like patients who mattered, like our recovery was important. We're just passing on what they taught us." The work was slow and often frustrating. Materials were scarce. Knowledge was limited. Many men they couldn't help effectively. But some walked again, some regained function. Some returned to something approaching normal life. And gradually the idea spread. Other doctors, other veterans, other people who cared began establishing similar programs. The infrastructure grew, piece by piece, built on the foundation of knowledge that men like Carl had brought back from American POW camps. Years later, in the 1960s, Carl attended a conference in Hamburg on prosthetic rehabilitation. Germany had developed sophisticated programs by then, influenced by American techniques but adapted to European conditions. The conference hall was full of doctors, therapists, engineers, prosthetists, hundreds of people dedicated to helping the wounded. During a break, an older doctor approached Carl. "I heard you were one of the first," he said, "one of the men who brought rehabilitation techniques back from America after the war." "I was just a patient," Carl replied. "The Americans did the teaching." "But you remembered what they taught. You applied it. You helped build what we have now." The doctor gestured at the conference around them. "This exists partly because you brought home the lesson that wounded people deserve comprehensive care." Carl thought about that. About Dr. Morrison spending hours examining his leg. About Lieutenant Brooks pushing him through painful exercises. About Corporal Fletcher adjusting his prosthetic with infinite patience. About an entire system built on the idea that human beings deserved to be helped, even when they were enemies. "The Americans understood something we didn't," Carl said slowly. "That treating wounded well isn't weakness. It's the opposite. It's strength so secure it can afford mercy. Wealth so abundant it can afford generosity. A system so functional it can invest in healing even those who fought against it. And you brought that understanding home." "I tried. We all did. Everyone who was treated in American hospitals, who learned from American doctors, who saw firsthand that there was a different way." Carl paused. The war destroyed Germany, but it also gave some of us the chance to learn from the enemy, to bring back not just our bodies but ideas about how societies should treat their wounded. That evening, back in his Munich apartment, Karl wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific. His mother had passed 2 years earlier. Most of his friends from the war were scattered or gone. Just a letter to record what he'd learned, what he wanted to remember. Fort Sam Houston, Texas, 1943, he wrote. The place where I learned that enemies could be decent, where American doctors fitted me with a prosthetic leg and American therapists taught me to walk again, where I discovered that strength included mercy, that power could be gentle, that even in war, humanity was possible. I carried that lesson home, built a clinic with Friedrich, helped wounded veterans learn to function again, watched as Germany slowly, painfully, rebuilt not just buildings but ideas about how to treat people who were broken. I don't know if I've made a difference. The work is too large, the need too great. But I know that every man I helped fit with a prosthetic, every veteran I taught exercises to, every person who learned to walk again, they all benefited from what America taught me. That generosity, given to an enemy prisoner, multiplied across decades. That's the power of decency. That's what strength secure in itself can achieve. Not through dominance, but through simple human kindness that echoes forward through time. I lost a leg in war, but I gained something more valuable, the understanding that the world doesn't have to be cruel, that even enemies can treat each other with dignity, that caring for the wounded, the broken, the defeated is not weakness but the highest expression of strength. Thank you, Dr. Morrison. Thank you, America, for showing me what was possible, for giving me back more than just mobility, for teaching me what humanity looks like, even in the middle of war. He sealed the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, where it would remain for his children to find after his death. Physical evidence that this transformation had happened, that an American hospital in Texas had changed not just bodies but hearts, that kindness given to enemies could reshape the world, one healed soldier at a time. Karl lived until 1987. He walked with a slight limp all his life, the prosthetic leg a constant reminder of both loss and unexpected grace. And every year on the anniversary of receiving that prosthetic, October 15th, he would raise a glass in private toast to the Americans who had treated him like a human being when they had every reason not to. Because that's what they had done. In the middle of war, in a Texas hospital, they had looked at broken enemy soldiers and seen not burdens, but patients. Not threats, but human beings who deserved comprehensive care. And that simple act of decency had echoed through decades, through Karl's clinic, through Friedrich's work, through the rehabilitation programs they helped establish, through every German veteran who learned to walk again, to function again, to live again. The Americans who fitted Karl's prosthetic never knew the impact they'd had. Dr. Morrison probably forgot Karl's name within months. Lieutenant Brooks moved on to other patients. Corporal Fletcher fitted hundreds of prosthetics before the war ended. But Karl never forgot them. And through his memory, through his work, through the lessons he passed on, their decency multiplied. Became not just one act of kindness, but a philosophy of care that helped shape post-war rehabilitation across Europe. That's what those disabled German POWs couldn't believe. Not just the quality of treatment, but its lasting impact. The way one nation's decision to treat enemies with dignity could transform not just individuals, but entire systems of care. America didn't just heal Karl's leg. They healed his understanding of what humans could be to each other, even in the worst of times. And that healing, like the prosthetic he wore for 44 years, supported him for the rest of his life.